Welcome to the Passing Through podcast, a show dedicated to exploring those spaces not just within, but also between and around us. The cracks in the walls, the moments between the moments, the silence that stitches a song together. This isn't a podcast about answers or about fixing the world. It's a space for listening, for slowing down and sitting in the unknown to see what might surface in the stillness.
Welcome to a special episode of the Passing Through podcast. This is going to be an educational episode about a training that I attended in Portugal. The focus of the training was peacemaking. And so that's going to be the focus of this episode. It's going to be tricky to try to condense a 5-day workshop down into a 60-minute episode, but I'm going to try my best. And the way I'm going to do that is by omitting certain things. So during this training, we spoke about violence, peace, conflict, nonviolent communication, a tool called resonant healing, active listening. We did daily movement practices and meditation practices. And if I have time, I will talk about some of those things. But I think what's more useful is to focus on peace, conflict, and nonviolent communication. Because I think if I focus in on those three things, I can stay under 60 minutes. And that's where a lot of the meat of this experience is. I also want to note that a large part of this experience was about nature, was about being in nature, because where the training was held was on a beautiful festival grounds where the Waking Life Festival is held. And Waking Life is a 5-day festival where 10,000 people come together to connect and celebrate and make music and art. And it's, from what I understand, an incredibly beautiful festival. It happens around a large lake, and I had the chance to work briefly with the land care team there. And so I wanted to start this podcast with a little bit of a land acknowledgement to honor that place, because it was really beautiful and it was home to a whole host of bird species and plants and fish and insects and these weird little alien looking crawdad things that were just dead. Some of them were alive, but most of them were just dead on the side of the lake, probably eaten by birds or ravenous human beings who were wandering through and saw a buttery little crustacean. But the lake itself was just beautiful. While we were there happened to be a lunar eclipse that I missed because I was too busy engrossed in conversation with other participants. And I didn't manage to catch the lunar eclipse reflected in this big, still lake that was like a mirror with the stars reflected into it. But I did get to spend time with the lake. I would greet it in the mornings when the rising sun would come up like a fire behind the forest, and the smoke would be rising up, the mist off the top of the lake. It looked like a giant witch's cauldron just bubbling in the morning. And it was really beautiful, just watching that growing mist gather, or at night watching the moon and stars reflected in the sprawling dark lake. It was really beautiful, and I'll try to put a video of that up on the episode link for this on social media. But what I wanted to say was that we spent, I don't know how many hours, a few hours, working with the land care team there, who have been working tirelessly to restore the waterways and address erosion and the loss of habitat there. They've planted a massive amount of trees and plants, and they have a permaculture garden, and they grow their own food, and they have an orchard, and they use syntropic farming. And for those of you who don't know what syntropic farming is a regenerative farming technique that leverages succession, which is another way to say growth cycles, you could think of it as. And they do this in order to provide a layer of shade and ground cover for the plants, and also a continuous harvesting of food over time, so that each layer, each story of this mini forest works synergistically with the rest. So this kind of mimics the way that nature works by planting a bunch of different species densely to build soil health without needing to till or dig the land. And the effect that this has is when you prune these trees and plants, you can do this thing that's called chop and drop, where you just run through there with a fucking machete or a chainsaw and you're just cutting things off and leaving them on the ground to decompose and fertilize the soil, which is fitting because seasonally, if you're in the northern hemisphere, that's what nature is doing at this moment. If you go outside, I was just walking through the park I used to live by in Berlin, and all the trees are yellow and gold and red and orange, and leaves are falling, and it's this beautiful fall flush of color that is nature's way of, you know, of dropping, of letting go, of hibernating, of beginning this process of composting to produce soil fertility for the coming spring, right? So, yeah, I like that there's this synchronicity about when this podcast is being recorded and what's happening seasonally around me. So that's the brief land acknowledgement there. I just wanted to honor what they're doing there and their restoration work and the regeneration and the people who have dedicated their time and energy into that work. It's very admirable. And yeah, I just wanted to note that at the beginning. So now that I've mentioned the land, I want to start unpacking the peace building frameworks that I mentioned earlier. But before we do that, I think we should speak a bit about conflict. Because when most of us hear conflict, we tense up, right? And you can feel that tension in your body. You can feel it in your shoulders. You might feel it in your neck. You might feel it in your stomach. You might feel it at your tailbone or your root chakra or deep inside the muscle fibers of your anus. You know, your third eye, as some of us call it. And we tend to think of peace as the absence of conflict, right? We usually define peace as like, it's this nice, easy, harmonious thing where nothing bad is happening. There's no tension, there's no conflict. But is it really? Is that what peace is? And why do we perceive conflict as negative? Why do many of us do whatever we can to elude and avoid conflict? I had a friend back in New York. His name was Jay, and he was one of the funniest people that I've ever known in my life. And we worked together, and he was young, but unfortunately he was bald. And he looked like Mini Me from Austin Powers. That was his nickname. That's what we all called him. And one day he was telling us a story from a time back when he had hair, which was unbelievable, but he claimed that there was a time. He even showed us a picture. And he had gone to the barber. He was getting a fresh cut and a fade. And at the end of the haircut, the barber gives him the mirror to take a look. And Jay looks in the mirror and he sees how his hairline had been completely fucking mutilated by the barber, and that he now had a 5 head instead of a 4 head. So the barber must have realized that Jay is unhappy with this haircut that he's received, if you can call it a haircut. And the barber asks him, what's going on? What's up? And Jay's telling the story to us, and he's like,
this motherfucker looked at me and he had the audacity to say, what do I think? How did I like it? He asked me how I liked it. And he knew he fucked me up.
So we're all laughing and we're like, damn, Jay, that's fucking, oh, that's terrible. So what did you do? What did you say? And he leans in and he pauses and he looks around and he whispers,
I said, thank you.
And so we all start laughing at this unexpected, end to the story. And we're looking at him like, what, really? Then he starts laughing and he's like,
yeah, I was scared, man. I didn't know what to do. I even tipped him.
I think it's a illuminating story because many of us have been in similar situations where we didn't want to cause tension, we didn't want to rock the boat, we didn't want to cause any problems. So even though we're dissatisfied and we're unhappy, we're still following through with what is expected, what's customary, what's courteous, just to avoid conflict. And in doing so, we're often erasing or denying or minimizing authentic feelings, like the sincere truth of our reality at that moment. And that happens because we as a culture are so aversive and avoidant when it comes to conflict, because we craft these narratives about conflict. We craft these stories that conflict is inherently bad. And I want to focus in on this point because I want to ask us, is it? Is there anything productive about conflict? Can conflict be a vehicle through which we come to understand and better know ourselves and each other? In my friend Jay's example, maybe had he chosen to be honest and lean into the conflict and share that he was unhappy, maybe he wouldn't have had to pay for that haircut. Maybe the barber would have gotten important feedback. Or maybe the barber would have grabbed the razor that was in his hand and lunged towards Jay's throat. Who knows what would have happened? I mean, I'm being facetious here, but I think eventually we come to realize that conflict isn't intrinsically negative or positive. Conflict just is. It happens. It arises and it falls away like all other things. It's what we do in response to that conflict, what stories we tell, what choices we make in response to the conflict. That's what makes conflict positive or negative. And we can tell ourselves different stories and see conflict as an opportunity for deeper peace. Okay, but then what is peace? If it's not just the absence of conflict, as I mentioned earlier, then what is it? What is peace? Is peace happiness? Serenity? Calm? Is it staring into the face of life's unrelenting struggles while remaining unshaken and equanimous? Or does peace mean something more? If we pause here for a second, just to breathe, to slow down, and to take a few moments to reflect on what sensations we have in our bodies. Do you feel peace? Right now, do you feel peace? If not, try and think back to a time in your life when you did feel peace. Maybe it was a long time ago. What was it like? Can you remember? And how does peace feel in your shoulders? The space between your eyebrows and your throat. How does peace feel in your chest or deep in your stomach? In your anus. Maybe you have a hard time connecting to the somatics of peace. I do. The irony is that if most spiritual and religious traditions of the world are right, then peace is always there, shining like the warm light of the sun. It's just that for many of us, that light has been eclipsed by the thick clouds of modern conditioning, by the harmful structures of empire and capitalism and coloniality, so that most of us are shivering in the cold chill of a gray and lightless sky. Maybe you could feel the chill. So we have to practice peace. It's a practice. It has to be cultivated. Let's talk about how we can do that. So before we talk about nonviolent communication here in a moment, I just want to bring into our awareness the idea of inner peace and outer peace. And of course, it's much more complicated than that because what's inner is outer and what's outer is inner. It's blurry and unfolding and relational and connective. That's the nature of reality. But for the sake of argument, allow me this reductive framing. Because when we think of inner peace and outer peace, and we put this dichotomy there, it does serve a useful function. Because the outer world, the people around us, the structures of oppression, politics, war, everything that's happening there seems largely outside of our sphere of influence, right? It's a bit paradoxical, actually, because it's not entirely true. But for the sake of argument, if we think of our smallest sphere of influence, it's ourselves, right? It's what's happening inside of ourselves. So if we develop practices like meditation, yoga, movement practices, any kind of somatic practice, any kind of mindfulness practice that allows you to be more in tune with what's going on with you in the moment and gives you more space to navigate your emotions, your thoughts, your judgments, your evaluations, and gives you a buffer with how you interact with the outside world, then this changes something, right? Because once you have more space inside of yourself to handle your own trauma, wounds, insecurities, doubts, fears, once you do that and you build up that resilience and that muscle and that capacity, you then have the ability to do it for others. So when someone comes to you in a crisis, you can hold them, you can see them, you can help them shoulder their burden. And so cultivating this inner peace is a crucial first step in this process, because without that inner peace, you don't have the space for others. And at the end of the day, what we are moving towards is a connective, relational vision of peace, right? And the way that we do that is we start on the inner level. It's the equivalent of putting on your mask first, and then you build it outwards. And so if you think of it in terms of scale, right, there's you as a unit, which is actually more complex because you don't necessarily exist as a single unit. You are made up of parts. But let's table that topic for another episode. Again, for the sake of argument, if the smallest sphere of influence that you have is you may live within a household. There are other people living in that household, presumably. And if not, maybe you live in an apartment complex. If not, you live in a village. And then that village makes up a larger community. Maybe there's a community of a municipality. That municipality belongs to a city. That city belongs to maybe a larger area, which maybe belongs to a state, which may belong to a nation, which may belong to a continent. And we keep going and going until we get to an Earth community. And then we're all living on this biosphere. And then you could keep extending outward to our cosmic community, right? We could go into our solar system. We could go out into the far reaches of the universe. It just keeps going and rippling outward like a wave. But the place where that begins, where you have insights and knowledge and volition and agency, is within relation to what you do, what you think, what you feel. And so just having that awareness that if you can make changes there, this ripples outward, that wave keeps moving. To go back to this example, maybe you are in a household, and if you have space inside of yourself to navigate the turmoil and tumult and turbulence of what it is to be a living, breathing being, you could then support those around you. So instead of getting angry when someone hasn't done the dishes, one of your roommates, the selfish motherfucker who's and leaving all of the dishes dirty, suddenly you might find yourself having more compassion for him. And once you have more compassion for him, he may feel more humanized. He may feel more of a whole person. And if you do this for everybody in your apartment, these people go out into their communities, into their places of work, into their families, and they become these little emissaries of love and light and compassion. And this ripples outward. And if enough people do this, you have a wave, and that ripples outward into a larger community, into a city, into a place, right? And you could start to see changes that scale up on a global level. So I just want to note that and shine some light on the fact that it is important to take responsibility, have accountability for how you conduct yourself, and engage in right speech, right action, right livelihood, so that you plant seeds that bear fruit, seeds that help, seeds that are in service to others, seeds that promote kindness and compassion and love. Because so often we are sowing seeds of misery. We're multiplying our misery. We're planting seeds of negativity, complaining, expectations, judgments, all of these things that don't serve our interests, the interests of others, or the interests of our biosphere as a whole. So just having that contextual awareness that we are situated in a vast web of relationship, keep that in mind as we continue this conversation, and keep that in mind as you think about peace and conflict. So now to get to the focal point of this episode, which is what is a tool that you can use to help you move away from this conditioning around defensiveness, certainty, control, being right, all these things that we're so acculturated to do, to debate people, to convert them, to fix them, to teach them the way. How do you move away from that to openness, to curiosity, to empathy? And the way that this happens is through language. And I want to pause here and just note that some of you may be listening and asking, well, wait a minute, aren't you trying to teach us something here? Aren't you making evaluations and saying that it's better to be open and curious and empathetic than it is to be defensive and vying for control? Yes. So back to language. Language shapes our perception. Language is a tool for truth telling, and it is what we use to world the world, right? The world that we live in, what we call the world, is an aggregate of stories, narratives, beliefs, opinions, judgments. And if we are aware of that and we realize that, then we understand how potent of a tool it is for transformation, for paradigm shifts, for just communicating with others in a way that helps me be seen and understood and feel a sense of belonging and community. The language I use is how people perceive me. And I know language isn't relegated just to the things that we say, right? There is an entire world of nonverbal communication that happens. In fact, most of our communication is nonverbal, how people feel around us, how we move in space, the energy that we give off. This is also part of what we could be more aware of and try to take notice of and be those feelings and embody them in ways that are more aligned with who we are, or who we want to be. So keep that in mind. But this is not the focus of this episode. This episode is primarily focused on the tool of nonviolent communication. And I guess I should just pause here briefly and say that I am not a huge advocate of nonviolent communication. I see it as powerful. I see it as useful. I see it as important. And I think talking about it can help people. It can reduce harm. It could increase your chances of getting your point across. And I think it's useful to discuss. The issues I have with it is that it can feel formulaic. It can feel kind of robotic and forced and unnatural. And people who have less than noble intentions could use it to manipulate others. This is true of many tools. They could be used for helping others or hurting others, and a whole bunch of things in between. So I just want to be transparent and say that I see some aspects of nonviolent communication as useful, and I want to focus on those. To me, what's useful about nonviolent communication is that it shows the mechanism for how misunderstandings, confusion, conflict, and escalation occur. And I think understanding that mechanism gives us tools to help diffuse it and to be able to just better navigate tensions and disagreements and to help ourselves be understood. So, nonviolent communication was created by a guy named Marshall Rosenberg. And he wrote a book called Nonviolent Communication, which outlines the whole method in great detail. I encourage you to read it if this stuff is interesting to you. Essentially, nonviolent communication breaks interactions down into 4 components: observation, feelings, needs, and requests. And each component has its own challenges and things that you should know about it. I am going to try to cover those as comprehensively as I can. But again, I am not an expert on this. I read the book. I've attended this course. I understand it conceptually, but I am not a scholar in nonviolent communication. So what we have to understand is that often we are judging, evaluating, having opinions, crafting narratives, and we're doing these things unconsciously. And often the first person that we're doing that to is ourselves, right? So we have a voice in our heads, and that voice is monitoring everything that's happening, and it's evaluating it, making judgments, making observations. For many of us, that voice is critical. I know it is for me. If I misspeak, if I say the wrong thing, if I make a bad joke, if I make any type of error anywhere, it's hard to find forgiveness. It's hard to find compassion, empathy, understanding. I find that the voice can be punitive, punishing, cruel, condescending. And that's happening invisibly often. And so if that's happening inside, this is interfering with inner peace, of course, and it makes it harder for a person to interact with somebody else, especially in a moment of conflict. So the first step, again, is working on clearing away those barriers inside, developing more familiarity, awareness with how you're speaking to yourself, and trying to change that voice in your head to one that is more nonviolent, we could say. Because if we can do it inside, it gives us a better chance at spotting the differences between observations and judgments outside. So when we're speaking to others, we can speak in a way that doesn't carry a charge, doesn't carry assumptions about someone's behavior. And I'm going to give you examples about what I mean in a moment. I'm just trying to set the stage a bit here. So let's use an example because examples are helpful, right? And I'm going to use an example that they used in the workshop here because I think it's a fun one. So 2 facilitators did a role play. One of the facilitators, she was seated on the floor on her phone, doing some kind of task. We don't know what she was doing, but she's on her phone. Second facilitator enters and is jumping around, speaking with the person who is on the phone, and the person who is on the phone is not responding. So the person who enters and who is speaking proceeds to touch the facilitator, keeps speaking, keeps moving around the room. Person on the phone still not responding, not reacting. And this is the scene. The scene ends. And they asked us what happened, what was happening here. And what was interesting is you see the magic of this process. Because I had read this book, like, I don't know, 15 years ago. So I understood the concepts and I knew what I was seeing, and I get it. But I didn't know that many of the other people hadn't been exposed to this and didn't know nonviolent communication. And I watched in surprise as everybody just projected their own narratives and stories about what happened. One person raises their hand and they say, yeah, it was so rude because she was clearly on her phone and she was busy and she was doing something. And then the other person just walked in and starts being loud and jumping around and touching her and violating her space and demanding her attention. And she was clearly busy. And then another person will raise their hand and say, well, I saw someone answered and was clearly excited and wanted to talk to somebody and connect, and they were just being ignored. And that was rude. Like, why couldn't she just look up from her phone and connect with her friend for a moment? And it just went around and around, and everybody had these stories and narratives about what had happened. And I was smiling because I understand that the whole point of nonviolent communication is to realize that that's what we're always doing. And I noticed how difficult it was for people to untangle the difference or to spot the difference between judgments and observations. People would say it was clear that she was busy because she was on her phone, or it was clear how excited she was because how much she was speaking or jumping around or touching, or the words she was using. And we have all these stories, but the whole point of nonviolent communication is to let go of the stories and just focus on what you can observe, because you don't have access to what's inside someone else's mind or someone else's heart, right? That's we could agree that that's a truth, I think. What we can do is observe things using our senses. So we can see things, we can hear things, we can smell things, we can touch things, we can taste things. These things we can know. So what we can say about that experience was what I said at the beginning, that there was someone who was on their phone, someone else came in, they were talking, moving around, jumping, touching the other person, but that person didn't engage. That's what we know. We don't know anything else. So this is an important distinction here. This first step, observation, is very tricky, and you have to be very careful because it's hard to catch ourselves and train ourselves and build up that muscle to let go of projecting our own stories and opinions and assumptions about the other person's motives, about what behavior we're seeing. So that's the first part, observation. Then the next part, which is equally challenging, is feelings. I remember when I was reading this book how mind-blowing it was to understand that when I say, I feel you don't love me, or I feel rejected, or I feel abandoned, or I feel unimportant, or whatever common set of things that we use to describe our feelings, aren't feelings, right? I feel you don't love me is a thought, not a feeling. I feel neglected, or I feel rejected, I feel unimportant. These are assumptions, they are evaluations about someone's intentions, right? It's a thought. I think I'm not important to you, right? This is really important because feelings, and they call these things pseudo feelings inside of nonviolent communication. So feelings in quotes like attacked, cheated, bullied, unseen, unheard, unwanted, invisible, patronized, all of these kind of things aren't actually feelings. Feelings are things like I feel angry, I feel sad, I feel vulnerable, I feel pain, I feel tired, I feel confused. These are feelings, and each of those things has its own shades and flavors, right? Like I could be sad or I can be depressed. I could be angry or I could be frustrated. I could be irate. I could be furious. I could be tired. I could be fatigued. I could be exhausted. You know, there's a whole spectrum of each of those emotions that you could get really specific, but we tend, when we speak to each other, not even to use emotions when we talk about our feelings. We use these pseudo feelings or thoughts. And so this creates massive confusion, misunderstanding, and ammunition for a conflict. Because if I'm the recipient of someone telling me, I feel you don't love me, now I already have to be on the defensive to prove that I love this person. Or if someone's saying, I feel rejected, now I have to defend the fact that my intention wasn't to reject you. But if instead this person had approached me and said, I feel pain, this is okay. I understand what you're feeling. It doesn't really have to do with me. I may have done something that resulted in you feeling that, but it isn't an assumption about my motives or my intentions. So it puts me in a position to hear you and see you and engage you and speak with you and work towards a peaceful resolution to what's happening. So that's the importance there of using the right words to describe our feelings. So we've spoken about observations, we've spoken about feelings. We're halfway there. The next one is needs, which is tricky because, we often conflate needs with strategies. So in terms of needs, we might say, and if we use the example of the role play with the two facilitators, someone might say that, I felt sad because I have a need for you to listen to me. Well, that's not a need, really. That is a strategy. Having someone listen to you is a strategy to fulfill your need of maybe connection or acceptance or belonging, for example. The need is usually like a higher level thing, and then you have strategies to fulfill that need. Maybe you have a need for play, and so what you do is you make jokes. Maybe you have a need for peace, so you take steps to set aside time for yourself to meditate or to read or to write, because these things give you a sense of peace. So if instead of communicating to someone a need, if you're giving them a strategy, then they could misunderstand you. So someone might have said, well, I was listening to you. And then you would say, no, because you weren't looking at me. And then you would say, oh, okay. And then you say, so your need is for me to look at you? Or I don't understand. And then you would be saying, no. And you're like, you're just not getting me. So it's important to use the right words when we're talking about observations, when we're talking about feelings, when we're talking about needs. And the final one is requests. Requests, I remember when I was reading the book, I had an epiphany. It was revelatory because I never realized the difference between a request and a demand. And I think many people don't understand this distinction because I had been in many relationships up until that point, and this was always a constant source of tension and conflict. And the difference between a request and a demand is that when I make a request and it isn't fulfilled, it's okay. I might be a little bit like, oh well, I had hoped that it would be fulfilled, but it's not a huge deal. I'm not upset about it. I'm not angry. I'm not triggered. If I make a request and it isn't fulfilled and I find myself enraged, I find myself feeling pain, I'm hurt, that wasn't a request, that was a demand. And so often we're making demands on each other and then being angry when our demands aren't met. So, what nonviolent communication encourages us to do is to make requests, make sure that the requests are simple, concrete, and specific. which again is tricky, right? So let's use this example. We have someone who's on their phone, seems they're busy doing something. They're totally absorbed in what they're doing. I come in, I don't realize any of that. I'm excited. There's something going on in me. I need to talk to someone. Maybe I'm in a crisis. Who knows? Something is alive in me. I need to come in. I try to engage with this person. They're not engaging with me. And this person tells me, hey, listen, I'm really busy right now. Can you come and talk to me later about this? I say, okay, cool. I leave. 10 minutes go by and I go back into the room and I engage them again. And suddenly they blow up at me and they say, I told you I was busy to come later. And I go, it is later. It's been 10 minutes already. Like, I thought you'd be done sending the email or whatever you're doing. And it escalates and turns into a big fight. The problem, the reason why that happened was because that request by the person who was on the phone was not specific enough. If instead that person had said, hey, I see that you need to talk to me right now. I'm really busy. I'm working on this email that I have to send. I have a deadline. Can you come back and we can talk in an hour? Cool. Okay, now I know. If I can't wait for an hour, I have a chance to say that. We figure out what to do. If I can wait for an hour, cool. But in the absence of providing that specificity and being precise, it just leads to the possibility of a rupture or a point of conflict. So if we are careful, if we are checking in and noticing the distinction between our observations and our judgments, if we're checking in and we're being careful about expressing our feelings and not our thoughts or our projections or these pseudo feelings, if we are correctly expressing our needs and not conflating them with our strategies, and we are making requests that are specific, actionable, and clear, then we have eliminated so many of the common pitfalls and landmines and thorns that pervade our everyday interactions. And this is the beauty of nonviolent communication. Once we understand what's happening there, we can become more attuned to expressing ourselves in a way that would yield better outcomes. And so this is very helpful in building that interpersonal peace between others. And it's a useful tool if you've never been exposed to these ideas, as some of the people in the workshop hadn't been, and you saw the confusion, you saw the tension, and you saw people trying to explain how I feel you don't love me is actually a feeling, until you speak about it enough and then you start to see it dawn on them that, yeah, you're right, I see it. Yeah, that's true, that's not a feeling. And just that realization alone, that person is going to go out into the world, and it doesn't mean they're never going to do that or they're just going to be perfect all the time and always express their needs and feelings and requests clearly and always just make neutral observations that are free from judgment and assumption. Of course not. It's not how the world works, right? You're going to be triggered, you're going to be activated, you're going to fuck up, you're going to make mistakes, and that's okay. But if you understand that mechanism, it's really empowering and it really gives you a lot of autonomy and control in how you navigate conversations and conflicts in the future. And so that's why I wanted to focus on NVC, because we did other things, right? We had daily mindfulness practices, movement practices, breathing techniques, and these were important too, and these were really useful. And I think that those serve a function in a larger ecology of practices that can help you cultivate peace. But many people know those already. If you want to learn how to do meditation, if you want to learn how to do yoga, you could just do a YouTube search. I guess the same is true for nonviolent communication, but you don't hear about nonviolent communication as often as you hear about those other techniques and methods. So that's why in this episode, I wanted to focus on this technique. There were other things that happened at the workshop, cool land-based practices where I was speaking with a tree one day. There was a shamanic drumming course that was offered by a couple of participants from Estonia that was beautiful. There was an offering on duality and dualism that I found engaging and important. Asha and I even had a chance to do a little community building taster. So it was nice that the training invited participants to share what techniques they use and what wisdom and knowledge and insights they have that might be helpful for people in cultivating peace. And I really appreciated that. Overall, the training itself was beautifully held. It was put together well. The pacing was nice. The food was impeccable. Henrique, if you're listening, I love you. His cooking was amazing. I never felt as held and cared for by a chef in my life. And the conversations I had with him were deep and fun and engaging and cerebral and poetic. The facilitators were competent. The participants were cool and interesting and fun to be around. We played games at night. As I mentioned earlier, the space itself was beautiful. Everything about the training was great. It made me curious to go back and check out this Waking Life festival that happens. I made some new friends, some connections. I learned a lot. I feel like I learned as much through the interactions and conversations with others as I learned in the training itself, which just speaks to the richness of the participants and the connection and the space and everything that facilitated that. And just to close, after offering gratitude to the space holders, to the land, to the participants, to the cook who was feeding us, to the land care team for supporting the land there and helping it to regenerate and grow and flourish. All of those things are peace building, after all, right? Whether it's peace building through relationship, peace building through land care, peace building through food and feeding each other and nourishing each other so you can grow, peace building and space holding by providing spaces where people can interact and learn. All of this work is peace building. So much of what we do in our lives is peace building. There's a great book that I read by Francis Weller. I've spoken about it before on this podcast, and it's called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. He says the core task of our lives is to develop an apprenticeship with sorrow, right? Because life is going to be full of loss. Everything you love is going to be taken from you. You will yearn for things that you wanted and didn't get. You will lament things that you didn't want to happen, but happened. And I think a corollary apprenticeship that we are invited to build in this life is peace building, an apprenticeship with peace. Because we're going to be tested. We're going to have struggle. We're going to have pain. We're going to have trauma. And we have to interact with other people who are experiencing the same thing. And if we can heighten our ability to choose peace, to optimize towards peace, and see peace not as just an outcome, not just as a destination or a place, but instead as a relationship with all of life. This is something that we can deepen into. This can teach us something. This kind of perspective invites us to see what happens when we stop trying to fix or control and we start listening instead. Then we might see that there's a kind of peace that honors complexity, where contradiction and tension and paradox, all of these things can coexist. Again, peace is not the absence of conflict. Peace is not the absence of contradiction or tension or paradox. Life is full of those things and they will be there. They are pervasive. So by cultivating inner peace, it gives us an infrastructure. It gives us resilience. It gives us an ability to build peace outside of ourselves with others and scale that up. And it helps us realize that peace is relational and that peace requires collective responsibility, accountability, maturity, and that we have to work towards it. We have to cultivate it. So yeah, that's it for me today. As always, be good to one another. This episode spoke a bit about how you could do that. So I encourage you, I invite you to do it. Be good to one another. Be good to yourself. And I will talk to you next time.